When I bought my first house, I thought it was a dream come true. I was 28, single, and had finally saved enough to leave my tiny apartment behind. The house was a charming two-story Victorian on the outskirts of a small town in Pennsylvania. It was built in the early 1900s but was in great shape. The realtor told me it had a rich history, which I took to mean it was full of character. I moved in during the early spring, just as the trees bloomed. The first few weeks were spent unpacking and settling in. The neighbors were friendly, the town was quiet, and I quickly fell in love with my new home. But then, things started to happen. It began with little noises, creaks and groans that I chalked up to the house settling. Old houses make noise, right? But these sounds were different. They weren't the random pops and snaps of wood expanding and contracting. They were deliberate, rhythmic, almost like footsteps. The first time I heard it, I was in the living room reading a book. It was late, around midnight, and the house was quiet. I was just about to turn in for the night when I heard it, a faint thud coming from above, followed by a slow, steady creaking sound. It lasted for maybe 10 seconds then stopped. I sat there, book in hand, listening intently. My first thought was that a raccoon or some other animal had gotten into the attic. The house had been vacant for a few months before I moved in, so it wasn't out of the question. But as I sat there, the seconds ticking by, the noise didn't come back. I shrugged it off and went to bed, telling myself I'd check it out in the morning. But the next day, in the light of day, I forgot about it. The house was so peaceful and welcoming that the idea of something lurking in the attic seemed ridiculous. A few days passed without incident, but then it happened again. This time I was in bed drifting off to sleep when I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound coming from the ceiling. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I listened to the slow, deliberate movement above me. It sounded like someone walking around, but that couldn't be possible. I lived alone, and the attic was empty, or so I thought. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the sound of footsteps moving back and forth above my head. Finally, it stopped, and I lay there in the dark, too scared to move, too scared to sleep. The next morning I decided to check the attic. I grabbed a flashlight and pulled down the creaky old ladder that led up to the small, dusty space. The air was thick and musty, and I had to stifle a cough as I climbed up. The attic was empty. Empty, there were no boxes, no furniture, nothing. Just a few old cobwebs and a layer of dust covered the wooden floorboards. I spent a good 15 minutes up there, checking every corner, but there was nothing to explain the noises I'd been hearing. No signs of animals, no evidence of anyone else having been up there. Just an empty, silent space. I told myself it was my imagination, that I'd been hearing things. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The noises continued, sometimes during the day, but mostly at night. They were always the same, footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth in the attic. Sometimes I'd hear a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was just the house settling, but it became harder and harder to dismiss. I started losing sleep, lying awake at night, dreading the moment when the noises would start again. Then one night, something changed. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the now familiar sound of footsteps. But instead of the usual slow, measured pacing, I heard something different. A thud, followed by a low, guttural moan. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. The sound was louder this time, more distinct, and it was coming from right above my head. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and climbed out of bed, my hands trembling as I pulled down the attic ladder. The moaning continued, a low, mournful wail that sent chills down my spine. I climbed the ladder slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. When I reached the top, I shined the flashlight into the attic, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the corner of the attic, was a figure, a hunched, shadowy figure, its back turned to me. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long, bony arms that hung limply at its sides. Its head was bowed, and its whole body seemed to be trembling. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe, as the figure slowly turned to face me. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to bore into my soul, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the ladder, and slammed the attic door shut. I ran back to my bedroom, my heart racing, and locked the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep for the next 3 nights. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the attic, its hollow eyes staring at me, its mouth twisted in that grotesque, silent scream. I couldn't stay in the house anymore. I packed a bag and left, checking into a motel on the other side of town. I didn't know what I was going to do. I just knew I couldn't go back. I called the realtor the next morning and told her I wanted to sell the house. She was surprised, but she didn't ask any questions. I think she knew, deep down, that something was wrong with that house. It took a few weeks to find a buyer, and during that time, I refused to go back. I hired movers to pack up my things and bring them to the motel. I didn't care about the money I'd lose on the sale. I just wanted out. I've been living in a small apartment in the city ever since, trying to forget about what I saw in that attic. But I can't. Every night when I lie down to sleep, I hear it, the slow, deliberate footsteps, the low, guttural moan. And I know, deep down, that the figure in the attic is still there, waiting, watching, just beyond the reach of the light. It was late October, the time of year when the days grew shorter, and the nights colder. I had just moved into a small secluded cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan. It was a dream of mine, to live off the grid, surrounded by nature, far away from the noise and stress of city life. The cabin was old but well kept, nestled in a dense forest of towering pine trees. The nearest town was nearly an hour away, and the only road leading to my cabin was a narrow, winding dirt path. I remember the first night clearly. I was sitting by the fireplace, a warm cup of tea in hand, listening to the crackling of the fire. The cabin was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards and the wind howling through the trees outside. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but I relished the solitude. The second night, things started to change. I was lying in bed, the fire reduced to glowing embers, when I heard it, a faint whispering, barely audible, coming from outside the cabin. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I lay there straining to hear, I realized it was something else. The whispers were low, almost like a conversation, but I couldn't make out any words. It sounded as if multiple voices were speaking at once, blending in a haunting, dissonant melody. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and listened intently. The whispers seemed to be coming from the trees outside, growing louder and more insistent. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and slowly made my way to the window. The forest outside was dark, the only light coming from the moon overhead. I shined the flashlight into the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing there. The whispers continued, growing louder and closer, until they seemed to be right outside the cabin walls. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The whispers were relentless, a cacophony of voices blending, filling my head with their maddening, unintelligible murmurs. I covered my ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. It was as if the voices were inside my head, burrowing deep into my mind, twisting my thoughts into a tangled mess of fear and confusion. I don't remember how long I stood there, trembling in the darkness, but eventually the whispers began to fade. Slowly the voices grew quieter, receding into the distance until they were nothing more than a faint, lingering echo. The silence that followed was deafening, almost oppressive, and I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to make sense of what had happened. The whispers had been so real, so tangible, but there was no explanation for them. It was as if the forest itself had come alive, its trees whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, a trick of the wind and the shadows. But as night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over me. I found myself dreading the darkness, fearing what it might bring. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, more insistent, as if they were trying to tell me something. I lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, as the voices swirled around me, filling the cabin with their ghostly chorus. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The whispers were everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape the voices, but my body refused to obey. It was as if the whispers had taken control, binding me to the bed and forcing me to listen. The voices grew louder, more frantic, and I could almost make out words, though they were twisted and garbled as if spoken through the water. I don't know how long it lasted, but eventually, the whispers began to recede, fading into the night. When they finally stopped, I was left trembling and drenched in sweat. My heart was racing, my mind a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin another night. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I drove down the narrow dirt road, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, the whispers still echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I checked into a small, run-down motel. The room was cold and drafty, but it was a welcome relief from the oppressive atmosphere of the cabin. I didn't go back to the cabin. I couldn't. The thought of returning to that place, of hearing those whispers again, filled me with a terror I couldn't explain. I sold the property at a loss, telling the realtor that I had changed my mind about living in the woods. I didn't tell her about the whispers. I didn't think she would believe me. Hell, I wasn't even sure I believed it myself. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the wind is howling outside my window, I hear them. The faint, distant whispers, calling to me from the depths of the forest, beckoning me to return. And I know, deep down, that no matter how far I run, no matter where I go, I'll never escape the whispering shadows that haunt my dreams. I've always been a bit of a drifter, moving from one town to the next, never really settling down. My work as a freelance photographer allows me the freedom to travel, but it also means I often find myself in unfamiliar places, staying in cheap motels off the beaten path. One such place was the Green Pines Motel, a small, dilapidated establishment on the outskirts of a town so small it barely registered on a map. I'd been driving for hours, my eyes heavy from the monotonous stretch of highway, when I saw the flickering neon sign in the distance. Green Pines Motel, it read, the G and M barely lit, casting an eerie green glow over the parking lot. I was exhausted, and the thought of finding another place to stay seemed like too much effort. So, I pulled into the lot, parked my car, and made my way to the front desk. The lobby was just as run down as the exterior, with faded wallpaper peeling off the walls and a musty smell that permeated the air. An old man sat behind the counter, his eyes hidden behind thick glasses. He didn't say much, just handed me a key after I paid in cash. "Room 6, he said, pointing down the narrow hallway. I made my way to the room, the old carpet squishing under my boots with each step. The hallway was dimly lit, and the walls were covered in the same peeling wallpaper as the lobby. I reached room 6 and inserted the key into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dingy room with a single bed, a rickety nightstand, and a TV that looked like it hadn't worked in years. The window was covered with thick curtains that were probably once white, but had long since turned a sickly yellow. I didn't care about the state of the room. I was too tired to care. I dropped my bag on the floor, kicked off my boots, and collapsed onto the bed. It was lumpy and uncomfortable, but I was asleep within minutes. I don't know what woke me up, but I remember jolting awake in the middle of the night, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the neon sign outside the window. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, trying to calm my racing heart when I heard it. A soft, scratching noise coming from the wall behind the bed. At first I thought it was just the sound of the old building settling, but as I listened, the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like something or someone was clawing at the wall, desperate to get in. I sat up in bed, my eyes darting around the room, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The scratching continued, growing louder with each passing second until it was all I could hear. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up, my feet sinking into the worn carpet. I crept toward the wall, my heart in my throat, and pressed my ear against it. The scratching stopped. I held my breath, waiting and listening, but there was nothing but silence. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. I'd been driving for hours after all, and I was probably just overtired, but as I turned to head back to bed, I heard a low whisper, barely audible, coming from the wall. It was a soft hissing sound like someone was speaking through clenched teeth, but I couldn't make out any words. I froze, my blood running cold, and pressed my ear to the wall again. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, as if the person, or whatever it was trying to get my attention. I backed away from the wall, my heart pounding, and grabbed my bag. I wasn't going to stick around to find out what was behind that wall. I threw my things into my bag, not caring about the noise I was making, and headed for the door. As I reached for the doorknob, I heard a loud bang from behind me, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. I turned around, my heart in my throat, and saw that the nightstand had fallen over, its contents spilled across the floor. But it wasn't the fallen nightstand that made my blood run cold. It was the hand that was now protruding from the wall, clawing at the air as if trying to reach me. The skin was pale and withered, the fingers long and bony, the nails sharp and cracked. I stood there, frozen in place, as the hand continued to claw at the air, the whispering growing louder, more frantic. I didn't think, I just ran. I yanked open the door and bolted down the hallway, not daring to look back. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretching out in front of me like a never-ending tunnel. My feet pounded against the carpet as I raced toward the front door, the whispering echoing in my ears, growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. I burst through the front door and ran to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I glanced back at the motel, half expecting to see something chasing after me, but the parking lot was empty. The neon sign flickered in the darkness, casting eerie shadows across the lot. I finally managed to get the key in the ignition and started the car, peeling out of the lot as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that godforsaken place. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands still shaking, and tried to catch my breath. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but there was no explanation. Whatever was in that room, it wasn't human. I didn't care what it was. I was just glad to be far away from it. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that night. I figured no one would believe me, and honestly, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But I've never gone back to that town. Never even driven down that stretch of highway again. And every time I pass a rundown motel, I can't help but wonder what's hiding behind those walls, waiting for the next unsuspecting guest to check in. I recently moved to a small town, one of those places where everyone knows each other, and outsiders are treated with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. I was coming from the city, tired of the constant noise, and the idea of settling down in a quiet neighborhood seemed perfect. My new house was on the outskirts, a charming two-story place with a big yard and woods surrounding the property. It was exactly what I had been looking for. The first couple of weeks were uneventful. I spent my days unpacking, getting to know the town, and working from home. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, just the usual polite greetings and small talk. There was an elderly couple next door, the Thompsons, who were particularly welcoming. They'd lived in the neighborhood for decades and were happy to fill me in on the town's history. One thing that struck me as odd was the number of houses in the neighborhood that seemed empty. There were about a dozen homes on my street, but only 5 of them had people living in them. The others were dark, with overgrown lawns and no signs of life. When I asked Mrs. Thompson about it, she just shrugged and said people come and go in a town like this. It didn't seem to bother her, so I let it go. But then, strange things started happening. It began with the lights. At night, I'd noticed the lights in the empty houses flickering on and off, even though there was no one living there. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was probably just a glitch in the electrical systems, but it still made me uneasy. I mentioned it to the Thompsons one evening when they invited me over for dinner, but they just brushed it off, saying the wiring in the old houses was probably faulty. A week later I came home late from running errands in town. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a light on in the house across the street, the Johnsons' house. They were a young couple with a toddler, and we'd chatted a few times since I moved in. But as I watched, the light flickered and went out. I figured they had gone to bed and didn't think much of it. The next day, I saw Mrs. Johnson outside, packing up her car. I waved and walked over, but she seemed distracted, almost nervous. She told me they were going to visit family for a few days and would be back soon. I offered to keep an eye on their house, and she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Days passed, then a week, and the Johnsons didn't return. Their house remained dark, and their car was nowhere to be seen. I asked the other neighbors if they'd heard from them, but no one seemed to know where they had gone. The Thompsons were the only ones who didn't seem concerned. "People come and go," Mrs. Thompson had said, as if that explained everything. The nights were the worst. The lights in the empty houses continued to flicker on and off, and sometimes I'd hear noises, footsteps, creaking floors, even whispers. I told myself it was just the house settling, and the wind in the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One night, I woke up to a loud crash. My heart was racing as I grabbed a baseball bat from under the bed and crept downstairs. The living room was dark, but I could see that the front door was wide open, swinging on its hinges. I was certain I had locked it before going to bed. I stepped outside, my breath visible in the cool night air, and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I called the police. I didn't tell them about the strange lights or the noises. I just said someone might have tried to break into my house. An officer came by, took a report, and promised to patrol the area more frequently. But I could tell he didn't take me seriously. "Small towns are safe," he said. "You probably just forgot to lock the door." But I knew I hadn't. That night, the lights in the Johnsons' house came on again. I stood at my window, staring across the street, trying to figure out what was happening. And then I saw it. A shadowy figure moving inside the house, just barely visible through the curtains. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone to call the police again, but before I could dial, the lights went out, and the figure vanished. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I decided to confront the Thompsons. If anyone knew what was going on, it would be them. But when I knocked on their door, there was no answer. I walked around to the back of the house, thinking they might be in the yard, but everything was still. The house looked abandoned, no signs of life at all. I went back home, more confused and scared than ever. The neighborhood felt wrong, as if it was hiding something from me. I considered packing up and leaving, but I couldn't bring myself to go without finding out the truth. That night, I kept watch from my living room, the lights off, so I wouldn't be seen. Midnight came and went, and nothing happened. I was starting to think I had imagined everything when I saw movement outside, figures, dressed in dark clothing, moving silently between the houses. They went to the Johnsons' house first, disappearing inside for what felt like hours. When they came out, they were carrying something, a large, heavy object wrapped in a blanket. I couldn't make out what it was, but the way they handled it made my skin crawl. They placed it in the back of a van that had appeared out of nowhere, and then moved on to the next house. I wanted to call the police, but I was frozen in place, too terrified to move. My mind raced with possibilities. Were they burglars? Kidnappers? Something worse? I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. As I watched, one of the figures looked directly at my house. I ducked behind the curtain, my heart racing, but it was too late. They had seen me. The group gathered in front of my house, their faces hidden in the shadows. I couldn't see them clearly, but I felt their eyes on me, watching, waiting. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The van drove off, and the neighborhood was silent again. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. I kept my lights off, doors locked and windows covered, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they came for me. 2 days later, I decided to leave. I packed up what I could fit in my car and drove away without looking back. As I sped down the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the Green Pines Motel sign flickering in the distance. I didn't stop. I never found out what happened to the Johnsons, the Thompsons, or any of the other neighbors who disappeared. I didn't want to know. I moved to a new town, far away, and tried to forget about the Green Pines Motel and the strange disappearing neighbors. But sometimes, late at night when the lights flicker and the house creaks, I can't help but wonder if they're still out there, watching, waiting, and if one day, they'll find me again. I recently moved to a small town, one of those places where everyone knows each other, and outsiders are treated with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. I was coming from the city, tired of the constant noise, and the idea of settling down in a quiet neighborhood seemed perfect. My new house was on the outskirts, a charming 2-story place with a big yard and woods surrounding the property. It was exactly what I had been looking for. The first couple of weeks were uneventful. I spent my days unpacking, getting to know the town, and working from home. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, just the usual polite greetings and small talk. There was an elderly couple next door, the Thompsons, who were particularly welcoming. They'd lived in the neighborhood for decades and were happy to fill me in on the town's history. One thing that struck me as odd was the number of houses in the neighborhood that seemed empty. There were about a dozen homes on my street, but only 5 of them had people living in them. The others were dark, with overgrown lawns and no signs of life. When I asked Mrs. Thompson about it, she just shrugged and said people come and go in a town like this. It didn't seem to bother her, so I let it go. But then, strange things started happening. It began with the lights. At night, I'd noticed the lights in the empty houses flickering on and off, even though there was no one living there. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was probably just a glitch in the electrical systems, but it still made me uneasy. I mentioned it to the Thompsons one evening when they invited me over for dinner, but they just brushed it off, saying the wiring in the old houses was probably faulty. A week later I came home late from running errands in town. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a light on in the house across the street, the Johnsons' house. They were a young couple with a toddler, and we'd chatted a few times since I moved in. But as I watched, the light flickered and went out. I figured they had gone to bed and didn't think much of it. The next day, I saw Mrs. Johnson outside, packing up her car. I waved and walked over, but she seemed distracted, almost nervous. She told me they were going to visit family for a few days and would be back soon. I offered to keep an eye on their house, and she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Days passed, then a week, and the Johnsons didn't return. Their house remained dark, and their car was nowhere to be seen. I asked the other neighbors if they'd heard from them, but no one seemed to know where they had gone. The Thompsons were the only ones who didn't seem concerned. "People come and go," Mrs. Thompson had said, as if that explained everything. The nights were the worst. The lights in the empty houses continued to flicker on and off, and sometimes I'd hear noises, footsteps, creaking floors, even whispers. I told myself it was just the house settling, and the wind in the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One night, I woke up to a loud crash. My heart was racing as I grabbed a baseball bat from under the bed and crept downstairs. The living room was dark, but I could see that the front door was wide open, swinging on its hinges. I was certain I had locked it before going to bed. I stepped outside, my breath visible in the cool night air, and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I called the police. I didn't tell them about the strange lights or the noises. I just said someone might have tried to break into my house. An officer came by, took a report, and promised to patrol the area more frequently. But I could tell he didn't take me seriously. "Small towns are safe," he said. "You probably just forgot to lock the door." But I knew I hadn't. That night, the lights in the Johnsons' house came on again. I stood at my window, staring across the street, trying to figure out what was happening. And then I saw it. A shadowy figure moving inside the house, just barely visible through the curtains. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone to call the police again, but before I could dial, the lights went out, and the figure vanished. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I decided to confront the Thompsons. If anyone knew what was going on, it would be them. But when I knocked on their door, there was no answer. I walked around to the back of the house, thinking they might be in the yard, but everything was still. The house looked abandoned, no signs of life at all. I went back home, more confused and scared than ever. The neighborhood felt wrong, as if it was hiding something from me. I considered packing up and leaving, but I couldn't bring myself to go without finding out the truth. That night, I kept watch from my living room, the lights off, so I wouldn't be seen. Midnight came and went, and nothing happened. I was starting to think I had imagined everything when I saw movement outside, figures, dressed in dark clothing, moving silently between the houses. They went to the Johnsons' house first, disappearing inside for what felt like hours. When they came out, they were carrying something, a large, heavy object wrapped in a blanket. I couldn't make out what it was, but the way they handled it made my skin crawl. They placed it in the back of a van that had appeared out of nowhere. and then moved on to the next house. I wanted to call the police, but I was frozen in place, too terrified to move. My mind raced with possibilities. Were they burglars? Kidnappers? Something worse? I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. As I watched, one of the figures looked directly at my house. I ducked behind the curtain, my heart racing, but it was too late. They had seen me. The group gathered in front of my house, their faces hidden in the shadows. I couldn't see them clearly, but I felt their eyes on me, watching, waiting. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The van drove off, and the neighborhood was silent again. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. I kept my lights off, doors locked and windows covered, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they came for me. 2 days later, I decided to leave. I packed up what I could fit in my car and drove away without looking back. As I sped down the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the Green Pines Motel sign flickering in the distance. I didn't stop. I never found out what happened to the Johnsons, the Thompsons, or any of the other neighbors who disappeared. I didn't want to know. I moved to a new town, far away, and tried to forget about the Green Pines Motel and the strange disappearing neighbors. But sometimes, late at night when the lights flicker and the house creaks, I can't help but wonder if they're still out there, watching, waiting, and if one day, they'll find me again. I live in a small town where everyone knows each other. It's the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked, and kids ride their bikes until the streetlights come on. My family has lived here for generations, and nothing much has changed. That's why, when something strange happens, it sticks out like a sore thumb. I had just finished college and was back home for the summer before starting my new job in the city. It was a quiet night, one of those early summer evenings when the air is warm and everything feels calm. My parents were out of town visiting my grandparents, so I had the house to myself. I was looking forward to a relaxing night, just me, a few snacks, and a good movie. Around 11 p.m., I settled on the couch, the glow of the TV casting soft light across the room. The house was old, with creaky floors and a basement that always seemed colder than it should be. I'd grown up here, so I was used to the sounds the house made, but that night, something felt different. About halfway through the movie I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible creak coming from the back of the house. It was subtle, but enough to make me pause the movie and listen. At first I brushed it off, thinking it was just the house settling or the wind outside. But then it happened again, a little louder this time, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I muted the TV, straining to hear any other sounds. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I waited for a minute, maybe two, before convincing myself that I was overreacting. I unmuted the TV and tried to get back into the movie, but my mind kept wandering. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, I heard it again. This time it was a clear, deliberate sound, the creak of a floorboard, coming from the hallway near the kitchen. My heart started to race. It was just me in the house, so what could be making that noise? I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, standing up slowly. My hands were shaking as I moved toward the hallway, every instinct telling me to turn back, to get out of the house, but I had to see what was there. I couldn't just ignore it. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from my phone. The door to the basement was slightly ajar, even though I was sure I'd closed it earlier. I stared at it, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe the wind had pushed it open, or maybe I'd just forgotten to close it all the way. But deep down, I knew it was something else. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked open a little more, and I froze, my flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated the stairs leading down into the basement. I didn't want to go down there, but I couldn't just leave it like that. I had to know. I slowly descended the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The basement was pitch black, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow everything. My flashlight barely cut through it, revealing only the outlines of old furniture and dusty shelves. Everything looked normal, but the air felt heavy, like something was hiding in the shadows. As I reached the bottom step, I heard a noise behind me, a soft shuffling sound. I whipped around, shining the light back up the stairs, but there was nothing there. My breathing was shallow, fear gripping me like a vice. I took a few cautious steps forward, scanning the basement for any signs of movement. Then, Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure, standing in the far corner of the basement, just outside the reach of my flashlight. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal, with long, spindly arms. Its face was obscured by darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering as I tried to keep the beam steady. The figure didn't move, just stood there, silent and unmoving. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get out of the house, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure, couldn't shake the feeling that if I turned my back on it, it would be the last thing I ever did. Suddenly, the figure took a step forward, and I snapped out of my paralysis. I bolted up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, and slammed the basement door shut behind me. I locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. I backed away from the door, listening for any sound of movement from the basement, but it was silent again. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the house, not stopping until I was in my car with the doors locked. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What had I seen? Was it real, or just some twisted figment of my imagination? I ended up at a diner on the edge of town, the kind that's open 24 hours and always has a few people sitting at the counter. I walked in, trying to calm my racing heart, and ordered a coffee. The waitress must have noticed how shaken I was because she gave me a concerned look as she poured my drink. I didn't tell her what happened, I couldn't. What would I say? That there was a shadowy figure in my basement, and I was too scared to go back home? It sounded ridiculous, even to me. But I knew what I had seen, and it wasn't something I could easily forget. I stayed at the diner until the sun started to rise, the pale light of dawn filtering through the windows. I knew I couldn't avoid going back to the house forever, but I dreaded what I might find if I did. Eventually I forced myself to leave, driving back to the house with a sinking feeling in my gut. When I got home, everything was quiet. The front door was still locked, just as I had left it. I hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door and stepping inside. The house felt different, empty, but not in the way it should have. I made my way to the basement door, my heart pounding in my chest. I unlocked the door and slowly opened it, half expecting to see the figure standing at the bottom of the stairs. But the basement was empty, just as it had been before. I walked down the stairs, shining my flashlight into every corner, but there was nothing there. No figure, no sign of anyone, or anything, having been there. I wanted to believe it had all been a nightmare, that my mind had played tricks on me in the dark. But deep down I knew better. I couldn't explain what I had seen, but I knew it was real, and I knew it wasn't gone. For the rest of the summer, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards and every whisper of the wind through the trees set me on edge. I barely slept, jumping at every noise, and every shadow that passed by my window. When the time came to move to the city, I packed up and left without looking back. But even now, in my new apartment, far away from that small town, I can't escape the feeling that it followed me. That somewhere in the darkness, it's still watching, waiting for the right moment to show itself again. And when it does, I'm not sure I'll be able to run fast enough. It was a Friday night, and I was finally alone. My roommates had all gone away for the weekend, leaving me the rare and much-needed solitude of our shared house. We lived in an old 2-story house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees and far enough away from the main road that the nights were always quiet. Almost too quiet. I had just settled in with a pizza, a couple of beers, and a horror movie marathon when I heard it. A soft knock at the door. It was unexpected, and it made me pause the movie. The room suddenly felt colder. I wasn't expecting anyone, and our house was so isolated that we rarely had visitors, especially not at night. I glanced at the clock. It was 10:30 p.m. I debated whether to answer, but something told me that ignoring it would only make me more anxious. The knock came again, a little louder this time, more insistent. I got up, grabbed my phone off the coffee table, and I made my way to the front door. Peeking through the peephole, I saw a man standing on the porch. He looked to be in his late 30s, wearing a dark jacket with the hood up, obscuring most of his face. The porch light cast long shadows across his features, making it hard to see his expression. I hesitated before unlocking the door, leaving the chain on as I opened it just a crack. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice shaky. I tried to sound confident, but I was anything but. The man looked up at me, his eyes catching the light. They were cold and empty, and something about them sent a shiver down my spine. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "But my car broke down just down the road. I was wondering if I could use your phone to call for help." I hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong. The man's voice, the way he stood so still, almost too still, as if he was waiting for something. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there was more to this than what he was telling me. "I'm sorry, but I can't let you in," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can call someone for you though. What's the number?" The man didn't respond immediately. He just stared at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever, and I began to regret even opening the door. Then, he smiled, a slow, creeping smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's all right," he said, taking a step back. "I'll find another house." I watched him as he turned and walked down the steps, disappearing into the darkness. I closed the door quickly, locking it and bolting the chain. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. I went back to the living room, but the house suddenly felt too big, too empty. I tried to focus on the movie, but I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see the man's face staring back at me. Minutes passed, but the feeling of dread only grew stronger. I decided to call the police, just to be safe. Maybe it was paranoia, but something about that man wasn't right, and I didn't want to take any chances. As I dialed, I heard a noise from the back of the house, a soft thud, like something bumping against the wall. My blood ran cold. I hadn't heard the man walk around the house, but that didn't mean he hadn't. I quickly told the operator about the strange man and the noise, giving them my address. They assured me they would send someone out right away, but it would be at least 10 minutes before they arrived. I hung up the phone, listening intently for any more sounds. For a moment, everything was silent, and I started to wonder if I was just imagining things. Maybe the thud was just the house settling or an animal outside. Then I heard it again. This time, it was the sound of a window sliding open. My heart skipped a beat as I realized it was coming from the kitchen. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy lamp, and made my way toward the kitchen, trying to be as quiet as possible. When I reached the kitchen, I could see the window over the sink was wide open, curtains fluttering in the breeze. I hadn't opened it, and I knew it had been closed and locked earlier. Panic set in, and I started backing away, but then I heard a creak behind me. I spun around, lamp raised, but it was too late. The man from the porch was standing in the doorway, his hood down now, revealing a twisted smile. He held a long, thin knife in his hand, the blade glinting in the dim light. "You should have let me in," he said, his voice soft and mocking. He took a step closer, and I realized I had no way out. The back door was behind him, and the only other exit was the front door, too far away to reach before he could catch me. I backed up against the counter, clutching the lamp like a lifeline. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do, but I was frozen in fear. The man lunged at me, and I swung the lamp as hard as I could. It connected with his shoulder, and he stumbled back, a growl of pain escaping his lips. I didn't wait to see if he recovered. I bolted for the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps fast and heavy. I reached the door, fumbling with the locks, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the bolt undone. Just as I managed to pull the door open, I felt a hand grab my shoulder, yanking me back. I screamed, twisting out of his grip and slamming the door behind me as I ran out into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached the end of the driveway, where I saw the flashing lights of a police car coming down the road. The police arrived just in time. They found the man still in the house, trying to escape through the back door. They arrested him and took him away, but the fear didn't leave with him. The thought that he had been watching me, planning this, made my skin crawl. The police later told me that he was a drifter, a known criminal who had been involved in several home invasions. He had been stalking the area for weeks, looking for the perfect target. I had just been unlucky enough to be home alone when he decided to strike. It took me a long time to feel safe in my own home again. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of knowing that someone had been inside, waiting for the right moment to attack. Even now, years later, I still find myself double-checking the locks at night, peering out the windows into the darkness. Because you never know who might be out there, watching, waiting for their chance to get in. I've always been outdoorsy, loving nothing more than weekend camping or hiking in the woods. The peace, the fresh air, the sense of being completely detached from the world's chaos, it's what I live for. But after what happened last fall, I've never been able to enjoy the woods the same way. It was early November, when my friend Jake and I decided to go camping in a remote area of the Appalachian Mountains. We'd been there before, but this time we chose a different trail that was less traveled, and much deeper into the forest. The weather was perfect, cool, crisp, and just chilly enough to make the campfire feel like a cozy haven. We set up our tents in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines and oaks. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. As night fell, we sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The darkness around us was thick, the kind that absorbs every bit of light, making the fire seem even brighter. We were miles away from the nearest town, completely isolated from civilization, which was exactly what we wanted. Around midnight we decided to call it a night. Jake went to his tent, and I stayed up a little longer to enjoy the quiet. I don't know how long I sat there staring into the fire, but eventually I felt the weight of the day's hike catching up with me. I put out the fire and headed to my tent, zipping it up tightly before settling into my sleeping bag. I must have dozed off quickly because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to a strange noise. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but enough to stir me from my sleep. I lay there, listening intently, trying to identify the sound. At first I thought it might be the wind, but there was no breeze. The noise continued, a soft rhythmic whispering like someone was speaking just outside my tent. My heart started to race as I strained to hear what was being said, but it was too quiet to make out any words. The whispering seemed to move around the tent, circling it slowly. I held my breath, hoping it was just Jake messing with me, but something about the way the whispers sounded made my skin crawl. It didn't sound like Jake. It didn't sound human. I sat up, trying to convince myself that I was just hearing things. Maybe it was some kind of animal, or the wind playing tricks on me. But the whispering persisted, growing louder, more insistent. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I reached for my flashlight, flicked it on, and aimed it at the walls of the tent. The light cast long shadows, but nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Still, the whispering continued, and I could feel my fear rising. I had never been so terrified in my life. I grabbed my knife from my backpack and unzipped the tent with just a crack, shining the flashlight outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just trees, shadows, and the empty silence of the forest. I quickly zipped the tent back up, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering had stopped, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I felt like something was out there, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, waiting for me to let my guard down. I sat there, knife in hand, listening to the deafening silence. I must have stayed like that for hours, too scared to move or sleep. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, still clutching the knife. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light over the campsite. I felt a sense of relief as I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the warmth of the sun chasing away the lingering fear from the night before. Jake was already up, sitting by the remnants of the campfire, looking unusually serious. He glanced up as I approached, his face pale and drawn. "Did you hear anything last night?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my stomach sinking. "Yeah, whispers. Did you hear them too?" Jake looked around nervously before speaking. "I thought it was you at first, but when I called out, there was no answer. The whispers just got louder, like they were coming from all around me. A chill ran down my spine. "Did you see anything?" He shook his head. "No, but something's not right. I've camped in these woods my whole life, and I've never experienced anything like that." We decided to pack up and leave as quickly as possible. The morning light did little to ease the sense of dread that hung over us. As we were packing, I noticed something strange on the trees around our campsite. There were deep scratches in the bark, long and jagged, like something with claws had been circling our tents during the night. "Jake, look at this," I called out, pointing to the marks. He came over and inspected the scratches, his face growing even paler. What the hell could have done that? We didn't stick around to find out. We grabbed our gear and hiked back to the trailhead as fast as we could. The whole way, we felt like we were being watched, the hairs on the back of our necks standing on end. We finally made it back to the car and drove away in silence, both of us too shaken to talk. It wasn't until we were miles away from the woods that I started to feel like we had escaped something truly sinister. That night, I did some research online, trying to find any explanation for what we experienced. I came across stories about those woods, tales of people hearing whispers, seeing shadows, and feeling like they were being watched. Some said it was the spirits of the forest, others claimed it was something far more malevolent, something that preyed on those who ventured too deep into its territory. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't think I ever will. Whatever was out there that night, it wasn't just the wind or my imagination. It was something real, something dangerous, and it was hunting us. Now, every time I hear a whisper in the wind or see a shadow move in the corner of my eye, I remember that night in the woods, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for me to return. There's something about driving at night that puts me on edge. The darkness seems to close in around you, with only the headlights cutting through the blackness, revealing a few precious feet of the road ahead. I'm a delivery driver, and while most of my routes are during the day now and then, I'm forced to make late-night runs. This story takes place on one of those nights, a night I'll never forget. It was a little past midnight when I got the call to deliver a package to a remote cabin on the outskirts of town. The dispatcher seemed a little hesitant when she gave me the address, but I didn't think much of it at the time. It was supposed to be a simple delivery, in and out, with no complications. But as I drove deeper into the countryside, the roads became narrower and the houses more sparse, until there was nothing but trees on either side. The GPS led me down a long, winding dirt road that seemed to go on forever. My anxiety grew with every passing mile, the trees looming like dark sentinels. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The further I went, the more uneasy I became, but I was too far in to turn back. Finally, the cabin came into view, barely visible through the thick woods. It was old and weathered, with the paint peeling off the wooden boards. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of life. I parked my truck and sat there for a moment, staring at the cabin. Something didn't feel right. There were no lights, no vehicles, nothing to indicate that anyone was home. But the package had to be delivered, so I grabbed it from the back of the truck and made my way to the front door. As I approached, I noticed the front yard was overgrown, with weeds and grass reaching up to my knees. The air was heavy and thick, with the smell of damp earth and decay. I reached the porch, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. My hand hovered over the door, hesitating. Then I knocked. The sound echoed through the empty woods, but there was no answer. I knocked again, a little harder this time. Still nothing. I was about to leave the package on the porch when I heard a faint noise from inside, a soft shuffling, like someone moving around. I called out, "Delivery!" hoping to get a response, but the only answer was more shuffling followed by silence. Something wasn't right. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't just abandon the package. I tried the door, and to my surprise it creaked open. The inside of the cabin was pitch black, and the air was thick with a musty odor that made me gag. I took a step inside, my flashlight barely piercing the darkness. "Hello?" I called out again, but there was no response. The shuffling sound had stopped, and the silence was deafening. I was about to turn around and leave when I noticed something strange, a trail of muddy footprints leading from the door to the back of the cabin. They were fresh, still wet, and they weren't mine. My heart started to race as I followed the footprints, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The cabin was small, just a single room with a bed, a table, and a few chairs. There were no signs of anyone living there, no clothes, no dishes, nothing. But the footprints continued, leading to a door at the back of the room. I hesitated, every fiber of my being telling me to turn around and leave. But something compelled me to keep going. I reached the door and slowly pushed it open, revealing a set of stairs leading down into the darkness. The air coming from below was even colder, and the smell of decay was stronger. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs, my flashlight barely illuminating the narrow passage. The walls were damp, and the sound of dripping water echoed in the darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small, dimly lit basement. There was a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow light over the room. The first thing I noticed was the old rusted bed frame in the corner. It was stained and covered in dust as if it hadn't been used in years. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. In the center of the room was a large wooden crate, its lid slightly ajar. And from inside the crate, I heard it, a faint, muffled whisper, almost like someone was calling out for help. My hands shook as I approached the crate, the whispering growing louder with each step. It was incomprehensible, a mix of garbled words and soft crying. I wanted to run, to get out of that basement and never look back, but I couldn't leave without knowing what was inside. I reached the crate and hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. Then with a trembling hand I lifted the lid. What I saw inside made me stumble back in horror. There, curled up in the crate, was a man, his eyes wide and filled with terror. He was emaciated, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. His clothes were tattered, and his wrists and ankles were raw, as if he'd been tied up for a long time. But the worst part was his eyes. They were empty, hollow as if the life had been drained out of him. He reached out a skeletal hand towards me, his fingers trembling, and that's when I noticed the chain around his neck. Attached to the chain was a small rusted key. He pointed to it, his eyes pleading with me to take it. My mind was racing, trying to process what I was seeing. Who was this man? How long had he been here? And who had done this to him? Without thinking, I grabbed the key and yanked it off the chain. The man let out a soft sigh, his hand falling limp. His eyes closed, and he seemed to sink back into the crate, his body going still. I stood there, the key in my hand, unsure of what to do. My instincts told me to get out, but I couldn't leave him there. I turned to leave the basement, but the moment I reached the stairs, I heard the door at the top slam shut. My heart leaped into my throat, and I sprinted up the stairs, banging on the door with all my might. "Let me out!" I screamed, but there was no answer. Panic set in as I fumbled with the key, trying to unlock the door, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the whispering started again, louder this time, echoing through the basement. I spun around, my flashlight flickering as the light bulb above me began to dim. The crate in the center of the room was moving, the lid slowly closing on its own. The man inside was gone, replaced by a shadowy figure that began to rise from the crate, its form shifting and contorting as it grew taller. I stumbled back, tripping over the stairs as the figure loomed over me, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, filling my head with unintelligible words. I could feel the air around me growing colder, the smell of decay overwhelming my senses. In a blind panic, I slammed my shoulder against the door, trying to force it open. The figure moved closer, its form becoming more defined, like a person made of shadows. I could feel its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me with its sheer malevolence. I threw my weight against the door again, and finally, it burst open. I scrambled out of the basement, slamming the door behind me and bolting for the front of the cabin. I didn't stop until I was back in my truck, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I started the engine and floored the gas, tearing down the dirt road as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town, my heart still racing, my mind replaying what I had just witnessed. I tried to make sense of it, to rationalize what had happened, but nothing made sense. That cabin, that man, that thing, it was like something out of a nightmare. When I got back to the delivery depot, I told my supervisor what had happened, but he just looked at me like I was crazy. He said there was no record of any delivery to that address, and that the cabin had been abandoned for years. I didn't argue. I just wanted to forget the whole thing. But I can't forget. Every time I close my eyes, I see that man's hollow eyes, that shadowy figure rising from the crate. I've tried to go back to my normal life, but the memory of that night haunts me. I haven't been back to that part of the woods, and I never will. Because whatever was in that cabin, it wasn't human. And it's still out there, waiting. I've always been a night owl. There's something about the stillness of the night that I find comforting, the quiet allowing me to focus on my work or indulge in my favorite pastime, gaming. But there was one night, not too long ago, when that stillness became something far more sinister. It was a night that changed everything, a night that I now wish I could forget. It started like any other. I'd finished my shift at the local grocery store around 11 p.m., grabbed a quick dinner, and settled into my routine. My apartment was a small one-bedroom unit on the 4th floor of an old building. It wasn't much, but it was home. The creaking floors and drafty windows were just part of its charm, or so I told myself. That night, I was playing an online game with a few friends. We were deep into it when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, movement just outside my window. I lived high enough that birds occasionally flew by, so at first, I brushed it off as nothing. But then it happened again, and this time, it was slower, more deliberate. I paused the game and turned to look. The window faced the back of the building, where a narrow alley ran between the apartments. It was always dark back there, the only light coming from a single flickering street lamp. I stared at the window, my heart rate picking up slightly. For a moment I thought I saw a figure standing in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the light. But then the light flickered, and the figure was gone. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. Maybe my eyes playing tricks on me after staring at the screen for too long. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled in the pit of my stomach. I tried to get back into the game, but my concentration was shot. Every few minutes I found myself glancing at the window, expecting to see something, or someone, standing there. After a while I gave up, logged off, and decided to call it a night. As I got ready for bed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I couldn't shake the sense that someone was out there, in the darkness, just beyond my sight. I checked the window again, but there was nothing. Just the empty alley and the flickering light. I finally convinced myself to go to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with thoughts of what I might have seen. At some point I must have drifted off because I was jolted awake by a loud crash. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought it was part of a dream. But then I heard it again, a sharp metallic clanging, like something hitting the fire escape outside my window. My blood ran cold as I realized that someone, or something, was climbing up the fire escape. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but I hesitated. What would I say? That I heard a noise outside my window? They'd probably write it off as an animal, or just some random city noise. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. The clanging grew louder and closer. Whoever, or whatever it was, they were almost at my window. I had two choices: stay and find out what was coming, or get out of there. The decision was easy. I threw on a pair of jeans, grabbed my keys and phone, and quietly slipped out of my apartment. I didn't bother with shoes. My only thought was to get as far away from that window as possible. As I crept down the hallway, I could hear the clanging stop, followed by the sound of something, or someone, tapping on the glass. It took everything in me not to break into a run. I made it to the stairwell and practically flew down the steps, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I was outside the building, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I took a moment to catch my breath, then started walking. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay near that building. Not after what had just happened. I ended up at a 24-hour diner a few blocks away, where I sat nursing a cup of coffee and trying to make sense of it all. Was it just a prank? Had I imagined the whole thing? But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, the fear wouldn't go away. I stayed at the diner until the sun started to rise, then made my way back to the apartment. The building looked the same as it always did, but as I approached, I couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. I checked the fire escape as I walked up the steps to the front door. The metal ladder was still there, hanging down from my floor, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no disturbed dirt, nothing to indicate that anyone had been there. But I knew what I heard. I cautiously made my way back to my apartment, every creak of the floorboards setting me on edge. When I reached my door, I paused. The door was slightly ajar, the lock broken. I pushed it open slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The apartment was dark and still, just as I'd left it, but something felt off. I stepped inside, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave, but I had to know. The living room was empty, the kitchen untouched. But when I got to the bedroom, my blood ran cold. The window was wide open, the curtains fluttering in the breeze. And on the floor, just inside the room, was a single muddy footprint. It was too large to be mine, and there was no way I could have tracked in mud from the alley. My legs trembled as I backed away, my mind racing. Someone had been in my apartment, someone who had climbed the fire escape, opened my window and entered while I was gone. I grabbed my phone and dialed, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I didn't care if they thought I was crazy, I wasn't staying there another minute. The operator answered, and I quickly explained what had happened, leaving out no detail. She told me to wait outside for the police, so I did, pacing back and forth in the cold morning air. When the police arrived, they searched the apartment thoroughly, but found no sign of forced entry, other than the broken lock. There were no more footprints, no signs of a struggle, nothing to indicate that anyone had been there. They chalked it up to a faulty lock and told me to get it replaced. But I knew better. I'd seen that footprint, heard the sounds, felt the presence. Someone had been there, watching me, waiting. And now, they knew where I lived. I didn't stay in that apartment after that night. I packed up my things and moved out the next day, breaking my lease and paying whatever fees I had to. It didn't matter. I couldn't stay there, not with the knowledge that someone had been inside, that they could come back at any time. It's been a few months since then, and I've tried to move on, but the fear lingers. I find myself looking over my shoulder, double-checking the locks, and avoiding windows at night. I haven't told anyone the full story, not even my closest friends. They wouldn't understand. But I know one thing for sure, whoever or whatever was in my apartment that night is still out there, watching, waiting. And that thought alone is enough to keep me up at night. The silence of the darkness no longer comforting, but terrifying. When I was younger, my family owned a small cabin in the woods. It was a humble place, nothing fancy, but it was our getaway from the hustle and bustle of city life. Every summer we'd pack up and spend a few weeks there, enjoying the quiet, the fresh air, and the beauty of nature. The cabin sat on the edge of a dense forest, miles away from the nearest town. It was peaceful, isolated, and at times a bit eerie. One summer, when I was about 12, we decided to extend our stay until late September. The weather was still warm, and the thought of spending more time away from the city was appealing. My parents loved the cabin, and they were always trying to convince me to appreciate it as much as they did. At that age, I preferred my video games and the internet to hiking and fishing, but I went along with it, figuring I'd at least get some quiet time to read. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my days exploring the woods, fishing in the nearby lake, and reading by the fireplace. My parents were often out, hiking the trails or driving into town for supplies, leaving me alone at the cabin for hours at a time. I didn't mind. I enjoyed the solitude. But as the days went by, I started to notice something strange. It began with small things, a feeling of being watched, a rustling in the trees when there was no wind, shadows moving just beyond my line of sight. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the unease grew stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, I decided to venture deeper into the woods than I had before. I had a book with me and thought I'd find a quiet spot to read, away from the cabin. I wandered through the trees, following a narrow path that wound through the forest. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. I walked for about an hour before I stumbled upon something unexpected, a small weathered cabin nestled between the trees. It was old, much older than our cabin, with faded wooden walls and a sagging roof. It looked abandoned, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the cabin cautiously. The door was slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges as the wind blew through the trees. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The inside was dark, the only light coming from a small grimy window on the far wall. The cabin was empty, or so I thought at first. There was a table in the center of the room, covered in dust and cobwebs, and a few broken chairs scattered around. But as I stepped further inside, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the floor, in the corner of the room, was a large old-fashioned trunk. It was made of dark wood, with metal bands and a heavy padlock. But the lock was broken, the metal twisted and bent as if someone had forced it open. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to open it. I kneeled and lifted the heavy lid, the hinges groaning in protest. The smell hit me first, a foul, musty odor that made my stomach turn. Inside the trunk were old clothes, torn and stained, and beneath them, something even worse. Bones. At first I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. They were small, fragile-looking bones like those of an animal, but as I pulled back more of the clothes, I realized with horror that they weren't from an animal. They were human. The skull, partially crushed, confirmed it. I stumbled back, my heart racing, bile rising in my throat. I had to get out of there. I ran from the cabin, not caring about the noise I made or the branches that scratched my arms and face. All I could think about was getting back to my parents, to safety. When I finally made it back to our cabin, I was breathless and trembling. I tried to tell my parents what I had found, but the words wouldn't come out right. They looked at me with concern, but they didn't understand. They thought I was just a kid with an overactive imagination, spooked by the isolation of the woods. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak and groan of the old cabin making me jump. I kept seeing the trunk in my mind, the bones, the crushed skull. I knew I should have told my parents more forcefully, and made them understand, but I was too scared. Then, just as I was beginning to doze off, I heard it, the sound of footsteps outside my window. They were slow, deliberate, crunching on the gravel path that led to the front door. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped right outside my window, and I held my breath, praying that whoever or whatever it was would go away. But then the footsteps started again, moving around the cabin, closer to the door. I heard the faintest creak as the door handle turned, but it didn't open. My parents had locked it, thank God. The footsteps continued around the cabin, stopping occasionally as if whoever it was listening, waiting. I wanted to scream, to wake my parents, but I was paralyzed with fear. I could only lie there, my eyes wide, listening to the slow, steady footsteps as they circled the cabin again and again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded away, and the night was silent once more. But I didn't sleep. I didn't move until the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains. The next morning, I told my parents everything. I begged them to believe me, to leave the cabin and never come back. My mother tried to calm me down, but my father seemed to take it more seriously. He decided to take a walk with me to where I had found the old cabin, to prove that there was nothing there. We walked for hours, retracing my steps, but we never found the cabin. The path I had followed seemed to have vanished, and no matter how far we walked, there was no sign of the old structure. My father tried to reassure me that I had just imagined it, that it was a dream or a nightmare. But I knew what I had seen. We left the cabin that day, cutting our trip short. My parents never spoke of it again, but I could tell that my father was disturbed by what I had told him, even if he didn't show it. As for me, I never went back to those woods. The cabin, the bones, the footsteps in the night, they still haunt me. I've done some research since then, trying to find out if there were any records of missing people or strange occurrences in that area, but I've found nothing. It's as if that cabin, and whatever horrors it held, never existed. But I know better. I know what I saw, and I know that somewhere, deep in those woods, the cabin is still there, waiting for its next visitor. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to share my story online, but after what happened, I just need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone out there will believe me, or maybe it'll just be a warning to those who think they're safe in their own homes. It all started about a month ago. I had just moved into a new apartment, nothing fancy, just a small one-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood. The building was old, with creaky floors and thin walls, but the rent was cheap, and it was close to my job, so I didn't mind. I liked the place. Something was charming about its age, the way it felt lived in, with stories in every corner. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking, settling into my new routine, and getting used to the sounds of the building. The creaks, the distant hum of neighbors' TVs, the occasional footsteps in the hall. They were all part of the ambience, just background noise that faded away as I got more comfortable. But then, one night, something changed. It was a Friday, and I'd had a long day at work. I came home, made a quick dinner, and settled down on the couch to watch a movie. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night and went to bed. I was out like a light as soon as my head hit the pillow. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first I didn't know why. I just had that strange feeling, like something was wrong. I checked my phone at 3:12 a.m. The room was dark, and the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I was about to roll over and go back to sleep when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible tapping. It was so faint that I thought I might have imagined it, but then it came again a little louder this time. It was coming from the window. Now, my bedroom is on the second floor, and there's no fire escape or balcony outside the window. There shouldn't have been anything out there that could make that noise. My heart started to race as I lay there, listening, trying to convince myself that it was just a branch tapping against the glass, or maybe a bird. But the tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, almost like someone was knocking, trying to get my attention. I sat up in bed, staring at the window, my pulse pounding in my ears. The room was pitch black, and I couldn't see anything outside. I'm not the type to scare easily, but something about this was deeply unsettling. I felt a cold knot of fear in my stomach, but I forced myself to get out of bed and check it out. I had to know what was making that noise. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the window as I approached. The tapping stopped the moment the light hit the glass, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move just outside the beam. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the curtain. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me not to look, but I couldn't help it. I needed to know. Slowly, I pulled the curtain back and shone the light outside. There was nothing there. The street below was empty. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the night was still. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and laughed at myself for being so paranoid. It was probably just my imagination running wild in the dark. I closed the curtain, double-checked that the window was locked, and crawled back into bed, feeling a little foolish but mostly relieved. I convinced myself that it was nothing, just the wind, or maybe even a bird that had flown away when I turned on the light. But the feeling of unease lingered, and it took me a long time to fall back asleep. The next night, everything was quiet. I went to bed at my usual time, read for a bit, and then drifted off to sleep without any trouble. But at 3:12 a.m., I woke up again, this time with a start. I didn't hear anything, but the same feeling of wrongness was there, stronger than before. I lay there in the dark, straining to hear something, anything, but there was only silence. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. For the next few nights, it was the same thing. I'd wake up at exactly 3:12 a.m., heart pounding, with that same inexplicable fear. I started dreading going to bed, knowing that I'd wake up in the middle of the night, terrified and alone. Then, one night, it escalated. I woke up, as usual, at 3:12 a.m., but this time the tapping was back, louder than before. It wasn't coming from the window this time, it was coming from the bedroom door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping was slow and deliberate, like someone was gently knocking, waiting for me to answer. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation, but there was none. I was alone in the apartment. The door was locked. There shouldn't have been anyone there. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but I was too scared to make a sound. Instead, I slowly reached for my phone on the nightstand, my hands trembling as I turned on the flashlight. I shone the light toward the door, half expecting to see it swing open, but it remained closed, the tapping continuing unabated. I forced myself to get out of bed, my heart hammering in my chest, and crept toward the door. With every step, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking so badly that I could barely grip it. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the door open and shone the light into the hallway. There was nothing there. The hallway was empty, just as it had been when I went to bed. The tapping had stopped the moment I opened the door, leaving only silence in its wake. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding, waiting for something to happen, but the apartment was still, the air heavy with an unnatural quiet. I searched the entire apartment, every room, every closet, even under the bed, but there was no sign of anyone. The windows were locked, the front door was bolted, and there was no way in or out except through the front door, which I hadn't heard open or close. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat on the couch, every light in the apartment turned on, waiting for dawn. As soon as the sun came up, I packed a bag and left. I didn't care about the lease or the money I'd lose, I just needed to get out of there. I stayed with a friend for a few nights while I searched for a new place. I didn't tell her why I was leaving, just that the apartment didn't feel right. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I knew what I had experienced wasn't normal. I moved into a new apartment a few days later, in a different part of town, far away from that place. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night without waking up, and the fear that had been gnawing at me began to fade. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still wake up, my heart pounding, expecting to hear that familiar tapping. I've checked the time, and it's always 3:12 a.m. I don't know what was in that apartment or why it chose me, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Maybe one night I'll hear that tapping again, and this time I won't be able to escape it. I've been a cop for nearly 15 years, and I thought I'd seen it all: murders, domestic disputes, bizarre accidents, but nothing prepared me for what happened one cold November night. It was the kind of case that stays with you, the kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew. It started as an ordinary shift. I was patrolling the usual routes, sipping on bad coffee to stay awake, when the call came in. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. Unit 5, we've got a possible break-in reported at 318 Maple Street. The suspect may still be on the premises. Proceed with caution. Maple Street was on the outskirts of town, a quiet residential area where nothing much ever happened. I couldn't recall ever getting a call from that address, but I figured it was probably just another case of a homeowner spooked by a raccoon or some kid messing around. Still, I knew better than to let my guard down. I flipped on the lights and headed that way, the radio still crackling in the background. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The voice on the radio sounded strained, almost hesitant, which was odd for our dispatcher. She was usually calm and collected, no matter the situation. I pulled up to the house around 11:45 p.m. It was an old Victorian, the kind that looked like it had seen better days. The paint was peeling, the yard was overgrown, and the place had a general air of neglect. But what struck me most was how dark it was. There were no lights on inside, and the whole street seemed unnaturally quiet. I parked the cruiser and radioed in my arrival, then stepped out into the chilly night air. The silence was oppressive, like the world was holding its breath. I approached the front door cautiously, hand on my holster, and knocked. "Police, is anyone home?" No answer. I knocked again, harder this time, but there was still no response. I tried the doorknob, and to my surprise it turned easily in my hand. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty interior. "Hello? This is Officer Daniels with the police department. I'm coming in." I stepped inside, flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and something else, something metallic, like blood. I felt a knot of unease form in my gut as I scanned the room. The furniture was old and covered in dust, and it didn't look like anyone had lived there for years. But there were fresh footprints in the dust on the floor, leading deeper into the house. I followed the tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. They led to a door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. I nudged it open with my foot, gun drawn, and stepped into what appeared to be a small study. The room was empty, but something caught my eye. A small, old-fashioned rotary phone sitting on a desk in the corner. The receiver was off the hook, dangling by its cord. The strange thing was that the cord wasn't plugged into anything. It was just lying there, disconnected, as if someone had yanked it out of the wall. Suddenly, the phone rang. The shrill sound cut through the silence like a knife, sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. I stared at it, dumbfounded. How could it be ringing if it wasn't connected? Against my better judgment, I picked up the receiver and put it to my ear. "Hello?" My voice sounded small and uncertain. For a moment, there was nothing but static on the other end. Then, a voice, faint, almost a whisper, came through. "Help!" The voice was distorted like it was coming from far away, but I could hear the desperation in it. My blood ran cold. "Who is this? Where are you?" There was a crackle of static and then the line went dead. I stood there, holding the phone, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? I set the receiver down and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. That's when I heard it, a soft creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight, coming from upstairs. I whipped around, gun raised, and listened. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by a faint thud like something heavy being dragged across the floor. "Police, come out with your hands up." No response, just another thud, closer now. I felt a chill run down my spine as I slowly made my way to the staircase. Every instinct told me to get the hell out of there, but I couldn't leave without knowing what or who was making those sounds. I started up the stairs, each creak of the old wood echoing through the house. When I reached the top, I found myself in a narrow hallway with several closed doors. The noise was coming from the room at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. I approached cautiously, my finger on the trigger, and nudged the door open with my foot. The room beyond was dark, but I could make out a figure standing in the corner, facing away from me. "Freeze. Turn around, slowly." The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent and still. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I stepped closer, my flashlight trained on the figure, and that's when I realized something was wrong. The figure wasn't a person. It was a mannequin, old and cracked, dressed in a tattered wedding gown. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its glassy eyes stared blankly ahead. But that wasn't the worst part. Lying on the floor at the mannequin's feet was a body, a woman, pale and lifeless, her throat slit from ear to ear. Blood pooled around her, soaking into the dusty carpet. Her eyes were wide open, frozen in a look of sheer terror. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't a break-in, this was a murder scene. But who had called it in? The phone in the study was disconnected, and there was no sign of a phone in the woman's hand or anywhere near her. My thoughts were spinning when I heard the voice again, faint and echoing through the house. "Help me!" It was coming from downstairs, from the study. The same voice, the same desperate plea. I ran down the stairs, my mind reeling, and burst into the study. The phone was still off the hook, lying on the desk, but the voice continued, growing louder and more insistent. "Help me, please help me." I picked up the receiver, my hand shaking. "Who are you? Where are you?" But the line was dead. The voice was gone. Only static remained. I dropped the receiver and backed out of the room, my heart racing. I needed to get out of there, to call for backup. But as I turned to leave, I heard something that stopped me cold. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming down the stairs. I turned, gun raised, and aimed at the staircase. The steps continued one by one, descending toward me. But there was no one there, just the sound of wood feet, growing closer and closer. I backed into the hallway, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, just out of sight. Then, the voice came again, louder than before, echoing through the empty house. "Help me, please, help me." I turned and ran, bursting out of the front door and into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my cruiser. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling, and finally got the door open. I radioed in for backup, my voice barely steady, and waited in the car, my eyes locked on the dark silhouette of the house. When the other officers arrived, I told them what I had found. We searched the entire house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of the woman's body, no blood, no mannequin in the wedding dress. The phone in the study was gone, and there were no footprints in the dust except my own. The place was empty, abandoned, like it had been for years. They didn't believe me, of course. They said it was stress, fatigue, maybe even a hallucination. But I know what I saw, what I heard. I've tried to rationalize it, to find some explanation that makes sense, but I can't. I've never been back to 318 Maple Street, and I never will, but now and then, late at night, I think I hear that voice again, faint and pleading, echoing in the back of my mind. Help me. Please help me. Driving a truck across the country sounds like a dream to some people. Endless open roads, freedom, solitude. But when you've been doing it as long as I have, you start to realize that there's a darker side to the highways, something that most people never get to see. I learned that the hard way. It was a few years back, on a stretch of I-80 in Nebraska, the kind of road where you can drive for hours without seeing another soul. I'd been behind the wheel for nearly 14 hours straight, pushing my limits to make a tight delivery deadline. I was exhausted, but I wasn't about to miss out on the extra pay for getting the load in ahead of schedule. The sun had set hours ago, leaving me alone in the pitch-black night, with nothing but the rumble of my rig and the occasional distant howl of the wind to keep me company. I'd just passed a sign that said the next rest stop was 50 miles away when I saw him. A man standing on the side of the road, his thumb out, hitchhiking in the middle of nowhere. I don't normally pick up hitchhikers, too many horror stories about people getting robbed or worse, but something about this guy caught my eye. He was tall and thin, with long greasy hair that hung down over his face. His clothes were dirty and tattered, and he wasn't carrying any bags or belongings, just standing there staring at me as I approached. I slowed down as I passed him, trying to get a better look. I don't know why, but there was something off about him. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Maybe it was the way he stood so still, like a statue, or the fact that I hadn't seen another car for miles. But against my better judgment, I pulled over a few yards ahead of him. I kept the engine running as I watched him in the rearview mirror. He didn't move at first, just stood there, staring at the back of my truck. Then slowly he started walking towards me. I felt a chill run down my spine as he approached. My hand hovered over the lock button, ready to hit it if he made any sudden moves. When he reached the passenger side door, he paused, looking up at me through the window. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. They were dark, almost black, with a hollow, empty look that sent a wave of unease through me. I rolled down the window just enough to talk. "Where you headed?" He didn't answer right away, just kept staring at me with those unnerving eyes. Finally, in a low, raspy voice he said, "East." I hesitated, but the silence of the night pressed in on me, making the air feel thick and oppressive. "I'm headed that way. You can ride with me as far as the next town." He nodded, in a slow, almost mechanical motion, and I unlocked the door. He climbed in without a word, settling into the passenger seat. The smell hit me almost immediately, a musty, earthy odor, like damp soil mixed with something metallic. I wrinkled my nose but said nothing, just put the truck back in gear and pulled onto the highway. We drove in silence for a long time. I kept sneaking glances at him out of the corner of my eye, but he just sat there, staring straight ahead, his hands resting on his knees. His clothes were even dirtier up close, stained with something dark that I didn't want to think about. And that smell seemed to grow stronger the longer he sat there. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, I'd picked him up in the middle of nowhere. He probably hadn't had a chance to wash up in a while. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I decided to break the silence, if only to ease the tension that had settled in the cab. "So, where you coming from?" He didn't answer right away, just kept staring ahead. I was about to ask again when he finally spoke, his voice even lower than before. "Nowhere." The word hung in the air like a bad smell, and I felt a shiver run through me. "What do you mean, nowhere?" "Everyone comes from somewhere." He turned his head slowly to look at me, and I swear I saw something shift in those dark eyes, like a shadow moving just beneath the surface. "I've been on this road for a long time," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Longer than you can imagine." A cold knot of fear settled in my stomach. "What do you mean by that?" He didn't answer, just turned back to stare out the windshield. The silence stretched on, heavier and more oppressive than before. I felt like the walls of the cab were closing in on me, suffocating me. The smell was unbearable now, thick and nauseating, like something rotting in the heat of the sun. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white, and tried to focus on the road. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that those dark, empty eyes were boring into the side of my head. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the lights of a small gas station up ahead. Relief flooded through me.